On April 30th, 1945, at 3:30 in the afternoon, a sharp gunshot echoed through the damp walls of a bunker buried beneath the ruins of Berlin. Nobody was completely certain they had heard it. Those waiting on the other side of the armoured door had been tense for hours, anticipating that moment, and yet when it came, some of them hesitated. Was it a real gunshot, or just another echo of the Soviet bombardment, filtering through meters and meters of concrete? Rochus Mish, the telephone operator who had spent years serving in that place, would say decades later that down there, in those depths, any loud noise that resonated through the concrete sounded like a gunshot. Their ears played tricks on them. There was enormous tension, and yet they were not sure. That moment of doubt, those seconds of silence before anyone dared to open the door to Adolf Hitler's private study, condenses all the madness, the chaos, and the disintegration of a regime that had sworn to last 1,000 years, and that, in the end, crumbled in a damp, foul-smelling hole saturated with fear, alcohol, and cyanide. But what happened inside that bunker in the weeks preceding that shot is a story that is rarely told with the depth it deserves. Because the collapse of the Third Reich was not merely a matter of lost battles and strategic maps. It was something far more visceral, far more human, far more disturbing. It was a man dragging himself through the corridors, drooling uncontrollably, obsessed with chocolate and pastries. It was a staff that sank into drunken stupors, while Soviet bombs shook the ceiling. It was a wedding in which the bride and groom swore to be of pure Aryan blood, while the world they had built upon that lie was literally crumbling above their heads. It was a dog poisoned to test whether the cyanide capsules worked. It was a 15-year-old nurse trapped in that subterranean hell who would become, nearly 80 years later, the last surviving witness to all of it. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like heart and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all corners of the world. Because the story we're going to tell today is not simply the chronicle of how a dictator died. It is the anatomy of how an entire system collapsed, seen from the inside, from the literal bowels of the earth, from a place that was, and this is not a metaphor, literally flooded. The Führer bunker sat below the water table of Berlin, which meant that groundwater seeped in constantly, generating unpleasantly damp conditions, with bilge pumps running continuously, day and night, without pause, to extract the water that threatened to reclaim that space. Electricity came from a diesel generator, whose constant hum became the background heartbeat of that subterranean existence. Drinking water was drawn from a well. Nobody talks about the fact that the final days of the Third Reich, those days that decided the fate of Europe and the world, unfolded in a space that was literally soaked, where the walls sweated moisture and the air had an almost physical weight. How did things come to this? How did the most powerful man in Europe go from marching triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées in Paris to rotting in a waterlogged basement while his capital burned? And what really happened within those concrete walls in the final days? Because what most people know is the summarized version. Hitler killed himself in his bunker, full stop. But the reality is infinitely more complex, stranger, darker, and in many respects more revealing of human nature than any summary could capture. To understand the ending, you have to understand the setting, and the setting was, in itself, a declaration about the mentality of the regime that built it. The Führer bunker was not simply an improvised air raid shelter. It was an underground fortress designed with the obsessive meticulousness that characterized the Nazi machine. Its roof was made of concrete, nearly 4 meters thick. 4 meters. To put that in perspective, the thickness of a typical house wall is about 20 centimeters. We are talking about a layer of reinforced concrete 20 times thicker, designed to withstand the direct impact of the heaviest Allied bombs. Hitler's earlier bunker, the Vorbunker, already had significant reinforcement, but the Führer bunker, built in 1944 as a deeper and more protected extension, took architectural paranoia to another level. Its approximately 30 rooms were protected by those nearly 4 meters of concrete above and equally thick walls on the sides. It was, in essence, a safe buried beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, in the heart of Berlin. And here comes a piece of information that seems almost absurd in its precision. The construction cost of the Führer bunker is documented to the last penny. It totaled exactly 1,349,899 Reichsmarks and 29 Pfennigs. 1,349,899 and 29. In the midst of total war, with millions of people dying, with entire cities being reduced to rubble, with the German economy on the verge of collapse, someone took the time to calculate the cost of that secret project down to the last cent. That bureaucratic precision in the midst of the apocalypse says a great deal about the mentality of the regime. The same meticulousness applied to the records of the concentration camps. The same obsession with documentary order, even as real order crumbled, was applied to the bunker where the leader of that regime would spend his final days. But if the exterior structure of the bunker spoke of paranoia and brute force, the interior told a different story, a story of vanity, of plunder, and of a grotesque luxury that contrasted violently with the actual conditions of life underground. Hitler's rooms in the lower section were decorated with high-quality furniture taken from the Reich Chancellery that stood above them, along with several framed oil paintings. These were not just any paintings. Among the works adorning the walls of that damp hole were pieces stolen from museums across Europe. In fact, a 16th century painting stolen from a museum in Milan was photographed among the bunker's rubble by Allied soldiers when they finally entered it. Italian Renaissance art hanging in a flooded basement in Berlin. That image, by itself, is a perfect metaphor for what the Third Reich was, the pretense of cultural greatness built upon looting, theft, and destruction. Access to the bunker was through a corridor adorned with a red carpet. Red, as if it were the entrance to a theatre or a palace, not an underground shelter in a bombed-out city. Despite the constant darkness and dampness, the bunker contained luxuries that were obscene given the situation: a wine cellar, fine furniture, quality upholstery. It was as if Hitler and his inner circle were attempting to recreate underground a miniature version of the world of privilege they were losing above. But the moisture corroded the furniture. The hum of the diesel generator never ceased. The air was heavy and stale, and the bilge pumps worked without rest against an enemy that was neither Russian nor American, but the very soil of Berlin, which was reclaiming its water. And who inhabited that space? Who was the man who lived behind that armoured door, in those rooms decorated with stolen art, walking on red carpets while his empire crumbled? Because the Hitler of the final months was a very different creature from the charismatic leader who had hypnotised millions. And here we enter one of the most disturbing and least known aspects of this story. The Third Reich did not fall all at once. It crumbled slowly inside a bunker full of paranoia, betrayal, and fear. What do you think was what really destroyed Nazi Germany? The Allies? Or Hitler himself? Leave it in the comments. There is a theory, backed by serious research, suggesting that the tremors everyone associated with possible Parkinson's were not only that. Author Norman Ehrler, in his exhaustive investigation, argues that while bombs were falling on Berlin, the Führer was going through something that no official communique would ever have admitted: drug withdrawal. Because Hitler, the leader who proclaimed racial purity and the strength of the Germanic body, was an addict. His drug consumption had intensified dramatically after July 1944, following the failed assassination attempt of Operation Valkyrie, when a bomb placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded meters away from him at the Wolf's Lair. After that event, Hitler began receiving injections of 20 milligrams of Eucadol, a potent opioid almost every other day, 20 milligrams. That was 4 times the standard medical dose. Eucodal was, essentially, oxycodone, one of the most addictive opioids known, and Hitler received it in massive doses, injected directly into his veins by his personal physician. That physician's name was Theodor Morell, and the relationship between Hitler and Morell is one of the strangest and most revealing stories of the Third Reich. Morell had been Hitler's personal physician since 1936, and over the years had administered an increasingly complex cocktail of substances that included vitamins, hormones, animal organ extracts, amphetamines, and finally opioids. Hitler trusted Morell blindly, despite the fact that other doctors in his circle considered the doctor a dangerous charlatan. But that trust broke in the final days. On April 21st, 1945, just 9 days before Hitler's suicide, Morell and his patient parted ways. And the parting was not amicable. Several witnesses present in the bunker at that moment recounted a scene that reveals just how deeply reality had finally penetrated Hitler's pharmacological bubble. He screamed at Morell. He screamed at him with a fury that those present described as terrifying. The exact words, according to multiple testimonies, were, "You've been giving me opiates the whole time. Get out of the bunker and leave me alone." It is an extraordinary scene when you think about it. The most powerful dictator in Europe, in the last days of his life, suddenly seeming to realise that he had been drugging himself, through his doctor, for months or perhaps years. It seems it was a revelation for Hitler, a late, pathetic, useless revelation, but a revelation nonetheless. Morell left the bunker that day and never returned. But what did that mean for Hitler? It meant that a man who had been receiving massive doses of opioids on a regular basis suddenly stopped receiving them. In medical terms, that is a recipe for brutal withdrawal syndrome. The symptoms of opioid withdrawal include tremors, excessive sweating, extreme anxiety, agitation, muscle pain, insomnia, nausea, and a deep sense of malaise. And indeed, the descriptions of Hitler in his final days align disturbingly with those symptoms. A general staff officer who saw him in those final days left a description that is difficult to read without feeling a mixture of horror and something resembling involuntary pity. He described Hitler in terrible physical shape, dragging himself slowly and laboriously from his rooms to the bunker's conference room, hurling his body forward and dragging his legs behind him as if they were objects foreign to his will. His eyes were bloodshot, and saliva often dripped from the corners of his mouth without him seeming to notice, or without him caring any more to maintain any appearance of dignity. This was the man who had made the world tremble. This was the leader before whom generals and field marshals had snapped to attention. This was the orator who had electrified crowds of hundreds of thousands of people with his incendiary rhetoric. Now he was dragging himself through a damp corridor, drooling, with red eyes, unable to walk upright. The distance between the image and the reality was abysmal, and yet, even in that state, he continued to issue orders. He continued to move imaginary armies across maps, demanding counterattacks with divisions that no longer existed, promising victories that were physically and mathematically impossible. And here is another detail that reveals the extent to which the collapse was total. One of Hitler's secretaries, who accompanied him until almost the end, left a testimony that is both mundane and chilling. She said that in his final days, Hitler's only obsession, apart from his military delusions, was sweet food. He lay there, completely apathetic, thinking only of chocolate and pastries, the secretary recounted. His craving for pastries had become pathological. Before he used to eat 3 pieces at most, but now he asked them to fill his plate to overflowing 3 times. A man who had controlled the life and death of millions, reduced to begging for more cake. There is something in that detail that is almost unbearably human, almost unbearably pathetic. It is not the image of the all-powerful monster that history usually presents. It is the image of a decomposing organism, a body destroyed by drugs, stress, and illness, seeking comfort in sugar like a sick child. But what was happening around him as he dragged himself between chocolate and fictional war maps? How did the staff, the officers, the officials who were trapped in that bunker with him react? Because that is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story. The collapse was not just that of one man. It was that of an entire system, and it manifested in ways that range from the grotesque to the surreal. As the net closed around the regime, as the sound of Soviet artillery grew closer each day, more constant, more deafening, the life of the staff in the chancellery and the bunker degenerated into something that can only be described as an end-of-the-world orgy. Drunkenness and decadence. That is what witnesses described over and over again. Officers who had sworn eternal loyalty to the Führer and the Reich were sinking into alcohol from early in the day. Martin Bormann, Hitler's brutal private secretary, one of the most powerful and feared men of the Third Reich, frequently made his way into the chancellery's extensive wine cellar from the early hours of the morning. As the notorious womanizer he was, Bormann found many willing followers in the increasingly carefree, increasingly hysterical, increasingly nihilistic atmosphere that took hold of the place as the Soviets approached. It is difficult to overstate the strangeness of that scene. Above, Berlin was being destroyed. The Soviets were advancing street by street, house by house. Civilians were dying by the thousands. Teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth were being sent to die with bazookas against T-34 tanks. And below, in the bunker and in the chancellery's dependencies, uniformed men were drinking cognac stolen from the cellar and chasing women through the red-carpeted corridors. It was as if, upon realising that their end was inevitable, all pretense of order, discipline and hierarchy had evaporated at once, revealing underneath not the superior race they claimed to be, but simply terrified human beings, seeking any form of anesthesia. And here comes one of the most striking testimonies. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect and Minister of Armaments, visited the bunker on April 23, 1945, a week before the end. What he found left him astonished. People smoking in the bunker's antechambers, half-finished bottles everywhere, and most significantly, only rarely did anyone stand up when Hitler entered the room. Conversation did not cease when he walked past. That might seem a minor detail, but in the context of the Third Reich, it was an earthquake. For 12 years, Hitler had been treated with an almost religious reverence. His entry into a room produced instant silence, electric tension, respect bordering on adoration. And now, in April 1945, people did not even bother to stop talking when he shuffled past. The spell had been broken. The wizard behind the curtain had been revealed for what he had always been, a mortal, fragile, broken man. Captain Bernd Freitag von Lorenhoven, one of the general staff officers who served in the bunker during those final weeks, documented in private diaries how the atmosphere changed day by day. He observed how the gap progressively widened between the reality of the war outside the bunker and Hitler's voluntary illusions about an imminent victory in the face of absolute ruin. In the military conferences, Hitler still talked of counterattacks, of divisions that would come to the rescue, of General Wenck's army supposedly advancing toward Berlin to break the Soviet encirclement, but the officers listening to him knew those divisions existed only on paper, that Wenck's army was a ghost, that there would be no rescue. And yet, nobody dared say it openly, at least not at first. Von Lorenhoven watched how in the last catastrophic week of the regime, the last hopes of officers and staff dissolved in alcohol and faded into suicidal despair. Suicidal despair. Those two words capture something essential about the atmosphere inside the bunker, because it was not simply a matter of people accepting defeat. It was a matter of people who had tied their fate so completely to that of the regime that they could not conceive of an existence outside it. For many of those down there, the end of the Third Reich meant literally the end of everything. And so, conversations about suicide became as common as conversations about the weather. People discussed methods, compared options, Cyanide capsules were handed out like sweets. It was a world where death had been normalized to a degree difficult to comprehend for anyone who had not been there. And how did that subterranean world communicate with the outside? How did Hitler, if he did, maintain any contact with military reality outside his bunker? The answer to that question is one of the most revealing details of the entire collapse. On April 27th, 1945, 3 days before the end, Berlin's communications had been almost entirely cut off from the rest of Germany. Secure radio contact with the defensive units, supposedly protecting the capital, had been lost. The general staff at the Führer bunker had to rely on precarious telephone lines to transmit instructions and this is the truly extraordinary part, on public radio to receive news. Public radio. The supreme commander of what remained of the German armed forces was learning what was happening in his own war by listening to radio stations like any civilian, and not just any station. The BBC. On April 28th, Hitler received a report that had been picked up from the BBC, originating from the Reuters agency, stating that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the man who had directed the machinery of the Holocaust, had offered to surrender to the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. Himmler, faithful Heinrich, the one who had sworn absolute loyalty, negotiating in secret with the enemy, and Hitler found out from the BBC, not from his intelligence services, not from his diplomatic channels, not from his encrypted military communications, from an enemy radio station. If there exists a moment that perfectly encapsulates the total collapse of a regime, it is that moment. The leader of the Third Reich, buried under 4 meters of concrete in a flooded bunker, listening to enemy radio to find out what his own subordinate was doing. Hitler's reaction to Himmler's betrayal was, according to all witnesses, volcanic. In a man who was already on the verge of physical and mental collapse, the news provoked an explosion of fury that shook even those who were already accustomed to his outbursts. For Hitler, betrayal was the unforgivable sin, the only thing that could pull him out of his growing apathy. And Himmler's betrayal was the final blow to any illusion he might have had left. If not even the head of the SS was loyal to him, then truly everything was over. It was in the hours following that revelation that Hitler made the final decisions that would define his last hours. While Berlin burned above, inside the bunker, some still believed they could win the war. If you had been there in the Reich's final days, would you have remained loyal or tried to escape? Let me know your opinion in the comments. But before reaching those final hours, we must speak of something that happened in that bunker which is rarely mentioned in documentaries and popular history books. Something involving an animal, and which reveals a cruelty so casual, so devoid of empathy, that it is difficult not to see it as a perfect reflection of the psychology of the man who ordered it. Hitler had a dog, a German shepherd named Blondie. She was, according to all testimonies, one of the few living beings for whom Hitler showed something resembling genuine affection. He loved her, or at least loved what she represented: unconditional loyalty, absolute obedience, absence of judgment. In the bunker, Blondie was with him, and Blondie had just had puppies. When Hitler decided he would commit suicide, he also decided he would do so with cyanide and a gunshot, to be certain. But he had doubts about the effectiveness of the cyanide capsules he had been provided. What if they did not work? What if he had been given fake capsules? Paranoia, which had always been a central trait of his personality, had intensified to pathological levels. In those final weeks, he trusted no one. He did not even trust his own poison. So he ordered his doctor to test the cyanide. On whom? On Blondie. On April 29th, 1945, 1 day before Hitler's suicide, Blondie was poisoned with cyanide. Hitler's great favourite was sacrificed by her owner to verify that the poison he himself planned to take was effective. It worked. Blondie died. And Blondie's puppies, those puppies that had been born in the bunker, that had spent their entire brief existence under 4 meters of concrete, were also executed. They were shot in the exterior courtyard next to the Führer bunker by the man in charge of Hitler's dogs, Feldwebel Fritz Tornow. 5 puppies, shot one by one in a garden full of bomb craters. There is something in that episode that transcends simple cruelty toward animals. It is the same logic that governed the entire regime. The lives of others, whether human or animal, only had value in terms of their utility to the leader. Blondie was not a beloved creature to be protected. She was a test tool. The puppies were not innocent creatures deserving to live. They were loose ends to be eliminated. That mentality, applied on an industrial scale, was what produced the Holocaust. Applied to the inner circle of the bunker, it produced this. A man poisoning his own pet to make sure his suicide would go well. After the death of Blondie and her puppies, Hitler proceeded to do 2 things that in their juxtaposition seem almost surreal. First, he got married. Then he said his goodbyes. The wedding of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun took place just after midnight on April 29th, 1945, in a civil ceremony inside the bunker. The official who married them was a certain Walter Wagner, a municipal councilman, who was located and brought to the bunker to officiate the ceremony. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, and Martin Bormann, the private secretary. And here comes a detail that seems taken from an absurdist novel, but is historically documented. As part of the ceremony, both Hitler and Eva had to swear under oath that they were of pure Aryan blood. In the full collapse of the Reich, with the Soviets a few streets away, with Berlin in flames, with the German army destroyed, with millions of dead piled on the conscience of that regime, someone ensured that the marriage forms included the sworn declaration of racial purity, the bureaucracy of hatred functioning until the very last second. It is an absurdly revealing detail. Even on the edge of the abyss, the rituals of Nazism were carried out with meticulousness. Eva Braun, now Eva Hitler, had arrived at the bunker of her own free will. She had refused all offers of evacuation. She had decided to die with the man she had loved for more than a decade from the shadows, always relegated to the role of secret mistress, never publicly acknowledged. And now, in the final hours, she finally received the recognition she had always sought. A ring, a surname, a title. Frau Hitler. She was that for approximately 40 hours before dying. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Champagne was raised. Conversation flowed. Someone incredibly recounted that the conversation drifted to old times, to memories of better days. And then Hitler retired to dictate his political testament, a document in which, even in his last ideological breath, he blamed the Jews for everything, demanded that the war continue, and designated his successors. Not even at the end could he abandon the rhetoric of hatred that had defined his entire public life. The hours of April 30th passed in a kind of slow motion. Hitler lunched with his secretaries and his cook. He said his goodbyes to the staff. The handshakes were mechanical, the words brief. Some wept. Others were too stunned to react. Then Hitler and Eva retired to his private study. The door closed, and then came the waiting. The wait was, according to those on the other side of that door, interminable. They knew what was going to happen. Hitler had told them what he would do. He had given them instructions about the cremation of the bodies. Everything was planned, organised with that bureaucratic meticulousness the regime never abandoned. But knowing that something is going to happen and hearing it happen are 2 very different things. And so they waited. Minutes that felt like hours. The silence of the bunker was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the hum of the generator and the distant sound of explosions. And then, according to some testimonies, there was a sound. A sharp sound. A gunshot. Rocius Misch, the telephone operator who was a few meters away, would later say he was not sure. Down there in the bunker, any loud noise that resonated through the concrete sounded like a gunshot. There was enormous tension. They had been waiting, anticipating it at any moment, for hours, and yet they were not sure. That uncertainty lasted only a few minutes. Heinz Linner, Hitler's valet, and Otto Günscher, his personal adjutant, opened the door. What they found inside that room has been described by multiple witnesses and reconstructed by historians to the last detail. Hitler was seated on the sofa in his study, with a bullet hole in his right temple. Beside him, Eva Hitler lay dead, with no visible wound. She had taken cyanide. On the table was a Walther PPK 7.65mm pistol. The bitter almond smell of cyanide mixed with the smell of gunpowder. There was blood on the sofa, blood on the floor, blood that, decades later, in 2025, would be analysed with DNA technology by Turi King of the University of Bath and confirmed as belonging to Hitler by comparison with the DNA of a living relative. A piece of very recent news that definitively closes any conspiracy theory about Hitler's survival. But Hitler's death was not the end of the bunker story. It was, in a certain sense, only the beginning of another, equally chaotic chapter. Hitler's and Eva's bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up the stairs to the Chancellery garden. They had been placed in a bomb crater and soaked with gasoline. And here comes another detail that seems too absurd to be real, but is documented by eyewitnesses. The cremation was so chaotic, so improvised, so different from any dignified ceremony, that it generated confusion even among the guards themselves. The man in charge of the cremation, seeing that the Chancellery grounds were being almost constantly bombarded by Soviet artillery, did not dare to remain next to the gasoline-soaked bodies to light them calmly. Instead, he ran toward the bunker entrance, lit a rag, and threw it toward the bodies from a distance. As a result, another guard who had not witnessed that desperate sprint to the door believed the bodies had spontaneously combusted. He thought they had caught fire on their own. That confusion, that small moment of chaos and incomprehension, is somehow the perfect epitaph for a regime that had been built on the illusion of total control and ended unable to properly cremate its own leader's body. The bodies burned for several hours, but never completely consumed. The charred remains were hastily buried in another bomb crater. Days later, when the Soviets took the Chancellery, they found those remains and began an investigation that would last decades and was marked by secrecy, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. But what happened to the other people who were in the bunker? What did they do when the door of the study opened and it was confirmed that Hitler was dead? Because the bunker did not empty instantly. Life, if it could be called life, continued down there for hours after Hitler's suicide. The first thing practically everyone did was light a cigarette. This might seem a trivial detail, but it is not. Smoking was strictly forbidden in Hitler's presence, as he was a fanatical anti-smoker. For 12 years, nobody had smoked in his presence. And now, minutes after his death, the bunker filled with cigarette smoke. It was the first act of freedom. Small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but symbolic. The spell had been broken in the most mundane way possible, with a cigarette. Then came the decisions. Some decided to try to escape. Others decided to die. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda made the most horrible decision of all, to kill their 6 children and then commit suicide. The children, whose ages ranged from 4 to 12, were sedated and poisoned with cyanide. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. 6 names beginning with H, in honour of the leader to whom their parents sacrificed everything, including their own children. Magda Goebbels, according to testimonies, was the one who insisted that the children could not live in a world without National Socialism. It is one of the most monstrous acts of the entire bunker saga, and it is difficult to process without feeling a physical, visceral horror that goes beyond words. After the Goebbels suicide, the bunker began to empty. Groups of people attempted to escape Berlin toward the west, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. Some succeeded, many did not. Martin Bormann tried to flee and, according to the most accepted evidence, died in the attempt, probably committing suicide with cyanide when he found himself cornered. His body was found decades later during construction work in Berlin, identified by DNA in 1998. But not everyone left. And here we come to one of the most extraordinary and least known stories of the entire bunker episode. The last man to leave the Führer bunker was not a general, was not a politician, was not an SS officer. He was an electromechanical engineer named Johannes Henschel. Henschel was the complex's electromechanical master, the man who kept the bilge pumps, the diesel generator, and the electrical system running. When everyone else had either left or committed suicide, Henschel stayed. Why? Because above the bunker, in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, there was a field hospital full of wounded soldiers who needed electricity and water to survive, and that electricity and water depended on the machines that only Henschel knew how to operate. So he stayed, alone, in an empty bunker, surrounded by the ghosts of everything that had happened there, keeping the machines running so that the wounded above would have light and water. An act of basic human decency in a place that had been the epicenter of the most absolute indecency. Henschel surrendered to the Red Army when Soviet soldiers entered the bunker complex at 9 a.m. on May 2nd, 1945. He was the last. The final curtain of the Führer bunker was lowered, not by a general or a political leader, but by an electrician who cared about some wounded men. And what happened to those who survived? To those who managed to get out of the bunker alive? Their fates were as varied as they were extraordinary, and each of them is a story in itself. Rochus Misch, the telephone operator who was not certain he had heard the shot, managed to escape from the bunker and from Berlin, but was captured by the Soviets. And what awaited him on the other side of capture was an ordeal that lasted nearly a decade. It is said that Joseph Stalin refused to believe that Adolf Hitler was dead. The Soviet dictator suspected the whole thing was a deception, that Hitler had escaped, perhaps to Argentina, perhaps to some secret location, and he wanted proof that Misch, as one of the last eyewitnesses, could supposedly provide. Misch was tortured by Soviet intelligence services to extract information about the whereabouts of a man who was already dead. The irony is so cruel it is difficult to process. At one point, the torture became so unbearable that Misch wrote to the head of the Soviet secret police, Lavrenti Beria, one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union, asking to be shot. He preferred death to continuing to be tortured for information he did not have, about a man who no longer existed. But they did not shoot him. They sent him to the gulags. Misch spent 6 years in Soviet forced labor camps before being released in 1954 under an amnesty agreed upon by Nikita Khrushchev. 6 years paying for having witnessed something he never asked to witness. Misch returned to Germany, lived the rest of his life in Berlin, and for decades was one of the most important living testimonies about what happened inside the bunker. He died in 2013 at 96 years of age, one of the last direct survivors of that subterranean hell. But even after Misch's death, survivors remained, and the last of them all was someone whose story is particularly moving because of her youth at the time of events. In July 2017, it was reported that Johanna Ruff, who at the time of her stay in the Führer bunker was a nurse of just 15 years old, was the last known survivor of the Führer bunker. 15 years old, a child, trapped in that place alongside dictators, generals, killers, and suicides. Ruff survived the war, survived the chaos of the post-war period, survived decades of history, and died on June 21st, 2023. With her death, the last living link to those underground days was severed. But how did things come to that point? How was the situation constructed that caused dozens of people to end up trapped underground while the world crumbled above them? To understand the end, we must go back. Not much, just a few weeks. because the bunker's agony did not begin on April 30th. It began much earlier, when there still existed an illusion, however thin, that things could be different. The final days of the Nazi regime were marked by chaos, denial, and absolute despair. What part of the Third Reich's collapse impacted you most? Let's discuss it in the comments. In early April 1945, Germany's military situation was desperate, but Hitler refused to accept it. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River, the last significant natural obstacle before Berlin, and was massing forces for the final assault. From the west, the armies of the United States and Great Britain were advancing rapidly through central Germany. The Reich was compressing like an accordion, squeezed from both sides, shrinking each day to a smaller territory. And yet, in the daily military conferences held in the bunker, Hitler continued to speak of counterattacks, of miracle weapons, of the possibility of exploiting the divisions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. That disconnection from reality was partly the product of the information bubble in which Hitler lived. For years, his subordinates had learned that bringing bad news was dangerous. Generals who reported honestly about the situation at the front were dismissed, humiliated, or worse. So reports were doctored, losses were minimized, lost positions were described as strategic retreats, decimated divisions were listed as operational units, and Hitler, increasingly isolated in his bunker, increasingly dependent on the drugs Morel injected into him, increasingly deteriorated physically and mentally, received those reports and built his fantasies of victory upon them. But reality had a way of filtering through even 4 meters of concrete. On April 12, 1945, a piece of news reached the bunker that provoked a flash of genuine hope in Hitler and his circle. The President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had died. The news electrified the bunker. Goebbels, with his propagandistic instinct intact until the very end, compared the situation to the death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia in 1762, which had saved Frederick the Great of Prussia from certain defeat during the 7 Years' War. That historical precedent, known as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, was one of Hitler's favourites, and Roosevelt's death seemed, for one vertiginous moment, as if history were about to repeat itself. Perhaps the Allies would split. Perhaps the new president, Harry Truman, would seek a separate peace. Perhaps everything could change. It did not change. Truman continued exactly the same policy as Roosevelt. The alliance with the Soviet Union held. The demand for unconditional surrender was not modified. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg did not repeat itself. And the hope that had briefly shone in the bunker extinguished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a darkness even deeper than before. On April 16th, the Red Army launched its final offensive on Berlin. The Battle of the Seelow Heights, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war, was fought less than 90 kilometers from the bunker. The Soviets lost thousands of men taking those heights, but they took them. There was nothing between them and Berlin except the increasingly weakened defences of a city already in ruins from years of Allied bombing. And here appears another of the forgotten characters in this story, a man whose fate illustrates the arbitrary madness of the regime's final days. General Helmut Weidlin was appointed to defend Berlin, the most important and most impossible mission any German officer could receive at that moment. But the extraordinary thing is that, just days before receiving that appointment, Weidlin had nearly been executed on Hitler's direct orders. Why? Because of a misunderstanding. Hitler believed Weidlin had withdrawn his troops without authorization, an act that in the Führer's vocabulary equated to treason and cowardice, the two unforgivable sins. Hitler ordered his arrest and execution. Weidlin, upon learning this, presented himself personally at the bunker to explain the situation and demonstrate that his troops had not retreated but had been pushed back by overwhelming Soviet superiority. Somehow, he managed not only to avoid his execution, but to impress Hitler enough to be appointed commander of Berlin's defense. From death row to commander of the last battle. Only in the chaos of the Third Reich's final days was something like that possible. Weidlin accepted the post knowing it was a death sentence of another kind. The defence of Berlin was impossible. Resources were insufficient. The available troops were a desperate mix of decimated regular units, fanatical SS members, elderly Volkssturm militiamen, and children from the Hitler Youth. Some of those children were 12, 13, 14 years old. They were handed Panzerfaust anti-tank bazookas and sent to face Soviet tanks. Many died without having fired a single shot. Others died after firing, when the tank they had attacked did not stop and crush them. They were the youngest and oldest soldiers of the entire war, fighting together in the last impossible battle. Weidlin did what he could, which was not much. He organised the defences, distributed the scarce resources, tried to maintain some order in the midst of chaos, but everyone knew how it would end. And when the end finally came, it was Weidlin who negotiated Berlin's surrender with the Soviets on May 2nd, 1945. The man who was nearly executed by Hitler ended up being the one who surrendered the Reich's capital that Hitler had sworn to defend to the last stone. But what was happening in Berlin while all this occurred underground? Because the bunker did not exist in a vacuum. It existed beneath a city that was experiencing its own agony. An agony that affected millions of people who had not asked to be part of that nightmare. The Battle of Berlin, fought between April 16th and May 2nd, 1945, was one of the most destructive urban engagements in history. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers participated in the offensive. They faced fewer than 1 million German defenders, many of them poorly armed and poorly trained. The fighting was street by street, house by house, room by room. The Soviets employed a saturation artillery tactic that turned entire city blocks into mountains of rubble. The roar was constant, deafening, omnipresent. The civilians who remained in the city took shelter in basements, in metro stations, in any place that offered some protection against the rain of steel and fire falling from the sky. Conditions for civilians were apocalyptic. There was no running water in most areas of the city, no electricity, no fresh food. The rations the government distributed had been reduced to starvation quantities, and distribution itself had become impossible in many areas due to combat. People drank rainwater or water from broken pipes. They ate whatever they could find, hidden reserves, dead animals, anything. Hospitals were overwhelmed, without medicine, without anesthesia, with surgeons operating by candlelight while bombs fell. And there was another terror, one that Berlin's women feared as much or more than the bombs. The mass rapes committed by soldiers of the Red Army during and after the battle are one of the darkest chapters of the fall of Berlin. Estimates vary, but the most cited historians speak of between 100,000 and more than 1 million women raped in the Soviet zone. Survivor testimonies speak of repeated, group, indiscriminate assaults regardless of the victim's age. Women of 80 and girls of 10 were attacked. It was not an isolated phenomenon nor the work of undisciplined soldiers. It was widespread and in many cases tolerated or even encouraged by commanders as a form of revenge for the crimes German troops had committed in the Soviet Union. The war had created a cycle of brutality that fed upon itself, a spiral of violence where each atrocity was justified by the previous one, and where the primary victims were, as always, the most vulnerable civilians. While all this was happening above, in the bunker the disconnection was almost complete. Hitler moved divisions on the map that no longer existed. He ordered counterattacks with phantom forces. He demanded that positions be held that had fallen hours or days before. The general staff officers surrounding him participated in a charade that grew increasingly difficult to maintain, pointing to positions on the map, discussing tactics, as if any of it made any sense. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler turned 56 years old. It was the last time he left the bunker. He went up to the Chancellery Garden for a brief ceremony in which he reviewed a group of Hitler Youth members who had been recruited for the defense of Berlin. The photographs and film footage preserved from that moment show a stooped, trembling Hitler, with his left arm pressed against his body, awkwardly patting the cheeks of child soldiers, who looked at him with a mixture of adoration and terror. It was his last public appearance. After that, he went back down into the bunker and never saw sunlight again. It was also around that date that the farewells and flights began. Several Nazi leaders left Berlin under the pretext of special missions that were really attempts to escape. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, had moved to Bavaria weeks earlier. From there, on April 23rd, he sent Hitler a telegram asking if he could assume leadership of the Reich, given that Hitler was isolated in Berlin. Hitler interpreted the telegram as a coup attempt, dismissed Göring from all his posts, expelled him from the party, and ordered his arrest. The man who for years had been the regime's number two, its most visible hierarch, was discarded with the same ease with which one throws away a used piece of paper. Heinrich Himmler, as already mentioned, tried to negotiate on his own with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat. His idea was to offer himself as an intermediary for a partial surrender to the Western powers while continuing the war against the Soviets. It was a delusional plan, based on the assumption that the Allies would prefer to negotiate with a moderate Nazi leader, as if such a thing existed, rather than allow the Soviets to take all of Germany. The Allies, of course, immediately rejected the offer, and when Hitler found out via the BBC, the reaction was what we already know. Albert Speer, who had been Hitler's favourite architect and his Minister of Armaments, visited the bunker on April 23rd in what was essentially a farewell visit. Speer had been sabotaging Hitler's scorched earth orders, the orders demanding the destruction of all German infrastructure. Factories, bridges, power plants, water networks, so they would not fall into enemy hands. Hitler had decreed that if Germany lost the war, the nation did not deserve to survive, and that everything should be destroyed. Speer, who despite all his subsequent crimes as a user of slave labour, had at least the clarity to understand that Germany would need that infrastructure after the war, had secretly issued counter-orders, instructing local authorities not to comply with the destruction directives. In his farewell visit to the bunker, Speer confessed this to Hitler. He told him he had disobeyed his orders. Hitler's reaction was surprisingly restrained. According to Speer, the dictator simply looked at him, without the explosion of fury everyone expected. Perhaps he was too exhausted. Perhaps, at some level, he no longer cared. Perhaps the drugs had dulled even his capacity for rage. Whatever the reason, Speer left the bunker alive, and years later, at the Nuremberg trials, would use that episode as a central piece of his defence, presenting himself as the good Nazi who had tried to save Germany from its own leader. But what about those who had no option to leave? Those who were trapped in that bunker not out of loyalty, but by circumstance. Because not everyone down there was a fanatical Nazi. There were secretaries, cooks, guards, technicians, communications operators, medical staff, people who had ended up in that place through the inertia of their careers, through the chance of their destinies, not through ideological devotion. For them, the final days were an exercise in psychological as much as physical survival. Hitler's secretaries, Traudl Juncker, Christa Schroeder, Johanna Wolf, and Gerda Christian, left testimonies that are among the most revealing documents about daily life in the bunker. Traudl Juncker in particular, who was the one who typed Hitler's final testament, left detailed memoirs that served as the basis for the documentary Blind Spot and the film Downfall. Juncker described the strange duality of life underground, the absurdly normal routine of shared meals with Hitler, the trivial conversation about dogs and vegetarian diets, juxtaposed with the monstrous reality of what that man represented and what was happening above. Juncker also described something that is psychologically fascinating. The way the bunker's confinement and isolation distorted the perception of time and reality. Without natural light, without contact with the outside world beyond the increasingly disastrous military reports, the bunker's inhabitants lost track of day and night. Meals were served at irregular hours. Hitler, who had always been nocturnal, maintained a schedule that had no relation whatsoever to the sun he could not see. He went to bed at dawn and woke up in the afternoon. His military conferences could be held at 3 a.m. The staff that depended on his rhythm lived in a state of permanent jet lag, exhausted, disoriented, unable to tell whether it was day or night without looking at a clock. And in that atmosphere of temporal disorientation and disconnection from reality, decisions were made that affected millions of people, orders that sent soldiers to their deaths, that determined which cities would be defended and which abandoned, that decided the fate of entire populations, were dictated in a damp basement by a man who had not seen the sun in weeks, who dragged himself through corridors drooling, who fed mainly on cake, and who had just gone through opioid withdrawal. The disproportion between the power he still nominally held and his actual state was obscene. But perhaps nothing better illustrates the strangeness of those days than an episode involving one of the most extraordinary and most controversial women in the history of aviation. Hannah Reich, test pilot, the woman who landed a plane in the middle of Berlin while the city burned. In late April 1945, when Berlin was practically surrounded by the Soviets, when the streets were battlefields and the sky was dominated by the Red Air Force, Hitler summoned Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim from Munich to Berlin. The reason was simple but absurd in context. He wanted to appoint von Greim as the new commander of the Luftwaffe in replacement of Göring, whom he had just dismissed. An order that could have been transmitted by radio or telephone became a suicidal mission, because Hitler insisted that von Greim come in person. Because for Hitler, forms mattered even when no substance remained. Von Greim needed a pilot who could land in a besieged city, and he found her in Hannah Reich, his lover and one of the best aviators in the world, a woman who had flown all manner of experimental aircraft, including rockets and combat gliders. Together they undertook a flight that was, by any rational measure, suicide. They flew over Berlin under constant anti-aircraft fire. The plane was hit. Von Greim was wounded in the foot by a bullet that passed through the fuselage, and Reich, with a coolness that defies all logic, landed the damaged aircraft on an improvised airstrip near the Brandenburg Gate, a wide avenue that had been cleared of debris and lampposts, to serve as the last aerial connection with the outside world. Reich and von Greim arrived at the bunker on April 26th. Hitler received them, appointed von Greim Field Marshal of the Luftwaffe, a Luftwaffe that at that point practically no longer existed, and Reich spent the following days in the bunker, witnessing the final disintegration. According to her own later testimonies, she begged Hitler to let her stay and die with him. Hitler refused. He ordered her to leave, to take von Greim out of Berlin so he could assume command of the remnants of the Air Force, and Reich obeyed. On April 28th, 2 days before Hitler's suicide, she performed her second impossible flight. She took off from that same improvised airstrip under enemy fire and managed to get von Greim out of Berlin. It was one of the last flights to leave the besieged capital. Reich's story is fascinating and problematic in equal measure. She was undoubtedly a brilliant aviator, brave to the point of recklessness, but she was also a convinced Nazi, a fanatical idealist who adored Hitler and who never, throughout her subsequent life, completely renounced her past. She died in 1979, and to the end maintained a disturbing ambiguity about her years in service of the regime. Her flight to Berlin is one of those episodes that demonstrate that personal courage and moral decency are completely separate things. One can be extraordinarily brave and be completely wrong at the same time. And von Greim, the man for whom Reich risked her life to get out of Berlin, the new commander of an air force that no longer existed, what became of him? he committed suicide. On May 24th, 1945, 3 weeks after Germany's surrender, when he learned he was to be handed over to the Soviets, he took cyanide, the same death as his Führer. The chain of suicides that extended from the bunker was extraordinary in its reach. Hitler, Eva Braun, Goebbels, and his wife von Greim, and dozens of other Nazi officers and functionaries took their own lives in the days and weeks following the war's end. It was as if the regime, in dying, dragged its most devoted believers with it, like a cult that self-destructs. But let us return to the bunker in its final hours, because there are details we have not yet covered, details that complete the picture of that final madness. One of the strangest aspects of the final days was the way hierarchy dissolved. In a regime that had been obsessively hierarchical, where rank and protocol were everything, the final days saw a total erosion of those structures. Doors that had previously been guarded were left open. Rooms that had previously been sacrosanct were used as improvised dormitories by anyone who needed a place to collapse. The wine cellar, previously reserved for the highest officials, was ransacked by everyone. Alcohol flowed without restriction, and with it came behaviours that weeks before would have been unthinkable. There are testimonies of SS officers, the same men who had been the embodiment of discipline and terror, completely drunk, wandering through the corridors with bottles in hand. There are testimonies of female staff being harassed. There are testimonies of screaming fights between men who before would have maintained impeccable composure. It was as if, upon realizing that the end was inevitable, all the facade of civilization the regime had maintained had crumbled, revealing underneath exactly what it had always been, a system based on brute power, where rules only existed as long as someone had the strength to enforce them. Martin Bormann, who as already mentioned was an incorrigible drinker and womanizer even under normal circumstances, completely let loose in those final days. His power inside the bunker was second only to Hitler's, and he used it to obtain everything he wanted: alcohol, female company, the best quality food, while the rest of Berlin was starving. Bormann was, in many respects, the personification of the regime's hypocrisy, a brutal man who preached austerity for the masses while living in indulgence himself. And what was happening with communications? How did the bunker stay informed about what was happening in the outside world during those final days? We have already mentioned that by April 27th, secure communications had been almost entirely lost. But even before that, the information reaching the bunker was fragmentary, contradictory, and often obsolete by the time it arrived. Messengers who tried to cross the lines to carry orders often never reached their destination. Telephone lines were cut and repaired and cut again. Radio operators worked on frequencies the Soviets constantly jammed. The result was an informational isolation that fed both paranoia and fantasy. Hitler received reports about the position of Wenck's army and convinced himself that rescue was on the way, but nobody could confirm or deny those reports with certainty. In the fog of war of those days, everything was possible and nothing was verifiable, and in that information void, Hitler's mind filled the spaces with what he wanted to believe. General Wenck, for his part, knew perfectly well that his army was incapable of breaking the Soviet encirclement around Berlin. But instead of attempting the suicidal counterattack Hitler ordered, Wenck made a decision that would save thousands of lives. He used his forces to keep a corridor open to the west, allowing both civilians and German soldiers to escape toward the American lines and surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. It was direct disobedience of Hitler's orders, but by that point Hitler's orders had ceased to carry any practical meaning for most field commanders. There is a moment in the chronology of those days that perfectly captures the gulf between the bunker's reality and the reality of the war. On April 25th, 1945, Soviet and American soldiers met for the first time at Torgau on the Elbe River. The two Allied armies that had advanced from opposite sides of Europe finally shook hands in the centre of Germany. It was the symbolic moment confirming that the Reich was split in two, that there was no possible escape, that the war was lost in an absolute and irrevocable way. And in the bunker, a few dozen kilometers away, Hitler was still discussing the possibility of a counterattack. How is it possible that an intelligent man, because Hitler, despite everything, was intelligent in many respects, could maintain that disconnection from reality? Was it madness, psychological denial, the drugs? Or was it simply that when your entire identity is built on a narrative of invincibility and destiny, admitting defeat is literally impossible because it equates to the annihilation of the self? It was probably a combination of all those factors. The physical deterioration caused by drugs, and possibly Parkinson's, affected his cognitive capacity. The informational isolation allowed him to select only data that confirmed his expectations. The culture of fear he had created around himself prevented anyone from telling him the truth clearly, and his own psychological structure, built on absolute certainty about his historical mission, made defeat literally unthinkable to him. It was not that he refused to accept reality, it was that his mind was incapable of processing it. But there was a moment when reality finally penetrated, a moment that several witnesses identified as the definitive breaking point. It was April 22nd, 1945, during a military conference in which Hitler discovered that a counterattack he had ordered, General of the SS Felix Steiner, had simply not taken place. Steiner did not have the troops to execute it. The order had been impossible from the start, and when Hitler found out, he suffered what witnesses described as a total collapse. He screamed. He wept. He declared that the war was lost. He said that everyone had betrayed him. He blamed the army, the SS, his generals, everyone except himself. He announced that he would stay in Berlin and commit suicide. Several of those present tried to convince him to leave, to fly to southern Germany, to the Alpine fortress that had been prepared as a last redoubt. Hitler categorically refused. He would die in Berlin. He would die in his bunker. And from that moment on, everything he did was preparation for death. That moment on April 22nd is the real turning point. Before it, there was at least a fiction of hope, a simulation of fighting for victory. After it, everything was preparation for the end. Testaments were dictated, final wishes were communicated, cremation plans were organized, cyanide capsules were distributed, and the atmosphere of the bunker shifted from tension to something worse, the certainty of imminent death. It is in that context that we must understand what happened to Goebbels' children, because that monstrous act was not a sudden burst of madness. It was a decision made days in advance, discussed, planned. Magda Goebbels had decided that her children would not live in a world without National Socialism. She dressed them in white, she gave them a sleeping potion, and when they were unconscious, she placed cyanide capsules in their mouths and closed their jaws to break the glass and release the poison. 6 children, one by one. In a room of the bunker that probably still smelled of the cigarette smoke people had been smoking since Hitler's death hours before. The brutality of that act is difficult to process even decades later. And yet, one must try to understand it, not to justify it, which is unjustifiable, but to comprehend the depth of the indoctrination, the totality of identification with the regime that caused a mother to see her children's death as preferable to life without Nazism. It is the logical extreme of a totalitarian ideology, when the individual identity fuses so completely with the state that the disappearance of the state causes individual life to lose all meaning. It must be noted that not all the bunker's staff shared that disposition towards suicide. Many wanted to live, many tried to escape, and the escapes from the bunker and the Reich Chancellery in the nights of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, were episodes of chaos, desperate courage, and tragedy. Several escape groups formed. The idea was to move through Berlin's streets northward, cross the Spree River, and then head west to try to reach the Western Allied lines before being captured by the Soviets. The route passed through a Berlin that was a hell of urban combat, fires, rubble, and corpses. Some groups tried to use the metro tunnels as an escape route, a decision that would prove fatal for some of them, because the Soviets, upon discovering that the Germans were using the metro as a troop and civilian movement route, made a brutal decision. There is evidence they deliberately flooded certain metro sections by opening the sluice gates, separating the tunnels from the Lamver Canal and the Spree River. Water rushed into the tunnels where not only soldiers, but also thousands of civilians were taking shelter, including women, elderly people and children. Estimates of the death toll from that flooding vary enormously, from a few hundred to thousands, and the episode remains controversial among historians. Some argue the flooding was accidental, the result of combat damage to the infrastructure. Others contend it was deliberate. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: people drowning in the darkness of the metro tunnels, while the battle continued above their heads. Of the escape groups from the bunker, the most successful was probably the one that included several of Hitler's secretaries. Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, and Constanze Manziarli, Hitler's cook, managed to get out of the Chancellery and advance through Berlin's streets. Junge and Christian eventually managed to cross the lines and survive the war. Manziarli disappeared during the escape and was never found. It is presumed she died, possibly committing suicide with cyanide upon being captured by Soviet soldiers, or perhaps murdered. Her exact fate remains one of the small unresolved mysteries of Berlin's final days. Martin Bormann, as already mentioned, also tried to escape and died in the attempt. For decades his death was a mystery, fueling conspiracy theories that he had escaped to South America like so many other Nazis. But in 1972, during construction work near Berlin's Lehrte station, 2 skeletons were found. One was tentatively identified as Bormann, and in 1998, DNA analysis definitively confirmed it was him. The most powerful man of the Third Reich, after Hitler, did not even make it past the first river. And what did the Soviets find when they finally entered the bunker? What remained of that place that had been the last centre of power of the Third Reich? The first Red Army soldiers to enter the complex did so on the morning of May 2nd, after Henschel, the electrician, pointed out the entrance to them. What they found was a scene of devastation and abandonment, empty bottles everywhere, half-destroyed burned documents, overturned furniture, the lingering smell of diesel from the generator, cigarette smoke, and something else nobody wanted to identify: the smell of bodies not yet collected, decomposing under the rubble. The Soviets searched the bunker meticulously. They were looking for Hitler, of course. Stalin, as we have seen, refused to believe he was dead. Soviet intelligence services, the Smersh, carried out an exhaustive investigation that included exhuming the charred remains from the Chancellery garden, dental identification of Hitler and Eva Braun by their captured dentists, and brutal interrogations of any survivors they could find. But the results of that investigation were classified by Stalin and not made public for decades. The Soviet dictator preferred to maintain ambiguity, perhaps to use it as a political tool, perhaps because he genuinely was not convinced, perhaps simply because secrecy was his natural mode of operation. The remains of Hitler and Eva Braun had a post-mortem fate as strange as everything else in this story. They were buried and disinterred multiple times by the Soviets, moved from place to place, finally brought to a Soviet military base in Magdeburg, East Germany, where they remained buried in secret for decades. In 1970, when the base was to be handed over to the East German government, the Soviets decided to permanently dispose of the remains. They disinterred them one last time, completely incinerated them, and scattered the ashes in a river. They did not want the grave to become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. It was the final cremation, the definitive one, more than 25 years after the first. The only things the Soviets kept were a skull fragment, with a bullet hole and part of the lower jaw. For decades, these remains were exhibited in Russian state archives as proof of Hitler's death. However, in 2009, a DNA study conducted by an American researcher determined that the skull fragment was actually from a woman under 40 years of age, probably not Hitler. The jaw, on the other hand, was examined by French researchers in 2018 and confirmed as consistent with Hitler's dental records. And then, in 2025, as already mentioned, the DNA analysis of the blood from the sofa provided the most recent and perhaps most definitive confirmation. But what happened to the bunker itself? What became of the physical place where all this occurred? That question has an answer that says much about how Germany has dealt with its past. After the war, the bunker fell within the Soviet occupation zone of Berlin and subsequently in East Berlin. The Soviets attempted to partially demolish it, but the 4-meter concrete structure resisted the explosives with the same effectiveness with which it had resisted bombs. It was, after all, exactly what it had been designed for. The Soviets sealed it and buried it under rubble and earth. During the Cold War decades, the site was near the Berlin Wall, in a no-man's land where nobody could access it. After German reunification in 1990, the government faced the question of what to do with the site. The decision was, deliberately, to do nothing. Not to make it a museum, not to mark it, not to allow it to become an attraction for Nazi sympathisers. For years, the place where the bunker had stood was simply a parking lot and a residential garden, with no marker or indication. Only in 2006 was a modest informational plaque placed describing the history of the site. There is no monument. There is no entrance to the bunker, which remains buried underground, sealed, inaccessible. Germany's decision was, in essence, to let the place fade, denying it any aura of importance or power. It is an understandable if debated decision. The bunker is still down there, its 30 rooms, its 4-meter thick walls, its red carpet probably rotted by decades of humidity, the empty frames where once hung paintings stolen from Italian museums. Everything is still there, beneath the feet of Berliners and tourists who walk above without knowing it, or knowing it but unable to access it. It is a sealed time capsule, an empty sepulchre of the Third Reich, buried but not destroyed, forgotten but not gone. And perhaps that is most appropriate, because the legacy of what happened in that bunker is not in the concrete walls or the rotted furniture. It is in the lessons history left us. It is in the warning it represents. It is in the demonstration of what happens when absolute power is concentrated in a sick, addicted, paranoid individual, surrounded by flatterers who are afraid to tell the truth. It is in the evidence of how an entire system can decompose from within, when reality ceases to matter and only the leader's fantasies remain. But there is another aspect of the bunker story that is rarely explored and deserves attention. It is not just what happened inside it, but what its very existence reveals about the nature of the Nazi regime in its final phases. Because the Führer bunker did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader network of bunkers, tunnels, and underground fortifications that the Nazis built obsessively throughout the war. The Führer Hauptquartier, the Führer's headquarters, had multiple locations throughout the war. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair by the sea in France, the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. Each more fortified, more paranoid, more disconnected from reality than the last. That obsession with burying themselves underground, with hiding behind meters of concrete, with creating controlled subterranean worlds, is a fascinating reflection of the psychology of totalitarian power. The leader who trusts no one needs an increasingly thick shell between himself and the world. And as the shell thickens, the disconnection from reality deepens, which generates more paranoia, which requires an even thicker shell. It is a cycle that feeds upon itself until it reaches its logical conclusion. A man locked in a concrete box underground, completely isolated from the world he supposedly governs, making decisions based on information that is no longer accurate about a world he no longer controls. The Nazis also built enormous underground complexes for weapons production. When Allied bombing destroyed factories on the surface, production was moved underground. Entire concentration camps, like Dora Mittelbau, were built inside tunnels excavated into mountains, where prisoners worked as slaves, producing the V-2 rockets Hitler hoped would change the course of the war. The conditions in those underground camps were even worse than those on the surface, which already says a great deal. The darkness was constant, the air was toxic from explosive gases and rock dust, and the mortality rate was horrifying. There is a dark symmetry in the fact that the regime that sent millions to die in darkness and confinement ended up dying itself in darkness and confinement. Hitler's bunker was, in a certain sense, his own concentration camp, a place from which he could not escape, where conditions were degrading, where the air was heavy and light non-existent, where death was a constant presence. The difference, of course, is that Hitler was there by his own choice, and that the victims of his camps had no choice whatsoever. But the final image is the same, a human being dying underground, in the darkness, far from the sun. And what does all of this tell us today? Why does it matter, more than 80 years later, what happened in a damp basement in Berlin? It matters because history is not just the past, it is a mirror, it is a warning. It is a reminder that human institutions, however powerful they may seem, are fragile. That power, when concentrated without checks and balances, corrupts in ways that end up destroying not only the governed, but also the governors. That truth matters, and that regimes built on lies inevitably crumble, taking with them all those who believed in them. Hitler's bunker is the perfect metaphor for totalitarianism, a closed space, without light, without fresh air, without contact with outer reality, where a group of people feed each other's illusions until reality finally breaks down the walls and sweeps them away. It is what happens when the door is closed on dissent, when honesty is punished, when flattery is rewarded, when loyalty is valued more than competence, when ideology substitutes for evidence. Each of the details we have explored here, from the constant dampness to the obsession with pastries, from the red carpet to the executed puppies, from the electrician who stayed to the 15-year-old nurse who survived, forms part of a larger picture, a picture that shows not only how the Third Reich ended, but why it ended that way. It could not have ended any other way. A regime built on lies, terror, and violence cannot have a dignified ending. It can only have the ending it had, chaotic, pathetic, bathed in blood, alcohol, and cyanide, under 4 meters of concrete, in a damp hole that flooded constantly. And there is something we must remember about the people who were down there. Not all of them were monsters. Some were, undoubtedly. Hitler, Goebbels, Bormann, but alongside them were secretaries who were simply doing their job, guards who were following orders, technicians keeping the machines running, a 15-year-old nurse who probably did not fully understand where she was or why. The story of the bunker is also the story of how ordinary people can be dragged into extraordinary circumstances, of how the machinery of evil uses common people as cogs, of how complicity is built gradually, decision by decision, day by day, until one day you find yourself under 4 meters of concrete, listening to a drooling man giving orders to armies that no longer exist. Johannes Henschel, the electrician who stayed to keep the electricity running for the wounded, made a decision in those final minutes that in its simplicity contrasts with all the megalomania that surrounded him. He sought no glory. He did not try to escape to save his own life. He did not commit suicide out of loyalty to a dead regime. He simply stayed where he was and kept doing his job because someone needed him. In the midst of all the madness, all the destruction, all the death, there is something profoundly comforting in that act of basic decency. An ordinary man doing something useful because it was the right thing to do. Johanna Ruff, the 15-year-old nurse, survived and lived a long life. When she died in 2023, she took with her the last direct memories of those days. Nobody remains alive who was in that bunker. All the witnesses have died. What remains are their testimonies, the documents, and the bunker itself, sealed beneath the earth of Berlin. silent and inaccessible, keeping its secrets under meters of concrete and decades of silence. The Third Reich lasted 12 years, 4 months, and 8 days. The agony of the bunker lasted approximately 10 days, from when Hitler decided to stay and die until the Soviets entered. 10 days that concentrate all the madness, all the horror, and all the pathetic humanity of a regime that promised eternity and did not last even a single generation. 10 days in which an empire came apart in a hole in the ground, with the red carpet soaked in moisture, the stolen art rotting on the walls, and a diesel generator humming its monotonous song while the world above burned. Now then, we have spoken of the bunker, of its inhabitants, of its final agony. But there is a dimension of this story we have not yet explored completely, and which is perhaps the most important of all. How did ordinary people live in Nazi Germany during those final months? Not the leaders, not the generals, not the bunker staff. Ordinary people. The millions of Germans who were not under 4 meters of concrete, but in bombed cities, in invaded towns, on roads full of refugees. What was daily life like when your country disintegrates around you? Because the war did not end only in Berlin. It ended in thousands of places simultaneously. In Dresden, reduced to ashes by the Allied bombing of February 1945. In Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, Frankfurt, cities that had been systematically destroyed from the air for years. On the roads of the East, where millions of German refugees fled the Soviet advance in one of the greatest forced migrations in human history. In the concentration camps being liberated by the Allies, where surviving prisoners, skeletal and sick, were the most terrible proof of what the regime had done. The experience of German civilians in the war's final months was a mixture of terror, hunger, confusion, and for many a brutal revelation about the true nature of the regime they had supported or at least tolerated for 12 years. When the concentration camps were liberated and photographs and films of what was found in them were disseminated, many Germans claimed they did not know. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We did not know, became the post-war refrain. Was it true? In some cases, perhaps. In many others, probably not. The camps were not on the moon. They were in Germany and in the occupied territories. Trains full of people passed through towns and cities. The smell from the crematoria reached kilometers away. Many knew, or at least suspected, but chose not to ask. For civilians living in cities, the final months were a hell of constant bombing. The Western Allies had perfected the technique of area bombing, which consisted of attacking entire cities rather than specific military targets. The logic was to break the morale of the civilian population and destroy industrial capacity. The result was the destruction of historic urban centres that had existed for centuries. The nights were the worst. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of existence. Basements and air raid shelters were the only safe places, and people spent hours, sometimes whole nights, crammed underground, listening to the roar of bomber engines and the whistle of falling bombs, waiting for their turn. When the bombs fell, it was not only the explosion that killed, it was the fire. Incendiary bombing raids, using thousands of small bombs designed to start fires, created firestorms that sucked oxygen from the air and generated temperatures above 1,000 degrees. People in basements died of asphyxiation before the fire reached them, or died boiled by radiant heat, or died crushed when the building above their heads collapsed. The bodies found after a firestorm were often reduced to unrecognizable forms, charred to the point of being indistinguishable from the surrounding rubble. In Hamburg, in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah created a firestorm that killed more than 42,000 people in a single night. In Dresden, in February 1945, death toll estimates range from 25,000 to more than 100,000, depending on the source. These figures are difficult to comprehend in the abstract, but let us imagine for a moment what it meant for an individual person. Imagine a woman who goes down to her basement when the sirens sound, with her children, with her neighbours. Imagine the sound of bombs falling ever closer. Imagine the building shaking. Imagine plaster dust falling from the ceiling. Imagine the moment the ceiling gives way, or the moment the air becomes unbreathable, or the moment the heat becomes unbearable. Multiply that experience by thousands, by hundreds of thousands, and you have the reality of strategic bombing. And who protected those civilians? Theoretically, the state. Practically, less and less. As the war progressed and resources ran out, the regime's capacity to maintain basic services deteriorated. Food rations were reduced month by month. Rationing, which had existed since the beginning of the war, became increasingly restrictive. By 1945, official rations in many cities had fallen below the minimum needed to maintain health. People resorted to the black market, to bartering, to searching for food in the countryside. Those with contacts in rural areas could obtain extra food. Those who did not went hungry. The healthcare system had collapsed. Hospitals were saturated with wounded from the front and bombing victims. Medicine was scarce. The youngest doctors had been sent to the front. Infant mortality was rising. Diseases that in normal times were treatable became fatal for lack of medicine and care. And over all of this, the regime imposed its control until the very last moment. The SS and the Gestapo continued operating, even when the front was only a few dozen kilometres away. The civilian population lived under a dual threat: Allied bombs from above and Nazi terror from within. Anyone who expressed defeatism, anyone who talked of surrendering, anyone who listened to foreign radio stations, could be arrested, tried by a summary tribunal, and executed. Thousands of Germans were executed by their own government in the final months of the war for cowardice, defeatism, or treason. Bodies were hung from lampposts, with signs saying things like, "I am a coward," or "I did not believe in the Führer," as a warning to others. The Fliegende Standgerichte, flying military tribunals, roamed cities and roads, looking for deserters and defeatists. A single neighbour's denouncement, a comment overheard by the wrong person, a joke about Hitler heard by a vengeful neighbour. Any of these could result in being hanged from a telephone pole. The regime's terror did not diminish with defeat. In many respects, it intensified. Like a wounded animal that becomes more dangerous in its death throes, the Nazi state became more brutal, more arbitrary, more murderous in its final months than at any previous time. And then there were the refugees. From January 1945, when the Red Army crossed the eastern borders of the Reich, millions of German civilians began fleeing westward. The provinces of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia emptied. Endless columns of people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, because men of military age were at the front or dead, dragged themselves along icy roads, in the middle of winter, pushing carts, carrying what little they had managed to save, dying of cold, hunger, exhaustion, or under the bursts of Soviet aircraft strafing refugee columns. The sinking of the ship Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th, 1945, was the worst maritime catastrophe in history. The ship, evacuating civilians and wounded from East Prussia, was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine in the frozen Baltic Sea. Of the more than 10,000 people on board, more than 9,000 died. 9,000 people on a single ship in a single night. That is 6 times more victims than the Titanic, and almost nobody outside Germany has heard of it, because the victims were German, and because the narrative of the war has no room for compassion toward the compatriots of the perpetrators. But that is precisely the complexity of history. The German civilians who suffered in those final months were not, for the most part, war criminals. They were people trapped in a system they had not created, or which they had supported without understanding its consequences, or which they had been too young to bear any responsibility for. The children dying of cold on the roads of East Prussia had not voted for Hitler. The women raped in Berlin had not operated the gas chambers. Collective guilt is a problematic concept, and the history of the final days of Nazi Germany forces us to confront that discomfort. It is possible to feel horror at what the regime did, and feel compassion for the civilian victims of its collapse at the same time. Both things can be true simultaneously. And what was happening to German soldiers at the front during those final months? What did it mean to fight a war that everyone knew was lost? For many soldiers, especially those on the Eastern Front, the motivation was no longer victory or ideology. It was fear. Fear of what the Soviets would do if they were captured. A fear fueled both by Nazi propaganda and by the reality of what German troops had done in the Soviet Union, and fear of the regime itself. Deserters were shot. Those who surrendered were considered traitors. There was no possible escape. Die fighting, die deserting, or perhaps survive if you were lucky enough to surrender to the Western Allies. The contrast between the Eastern and Western fronts was dramatic. German soldiers fought with far greater desperation against the Soviets than against the Americans and British, because they knew that capture by the Soviets meant, at best, years of captivity under brutal conditions, and at worst, death. Many Eastern Front units tried desperately to retreat westward, to surrender to the Western Allies. Wenck's army, which we have already discussed, facilitated exactly that. And amid all that chaos, all that suffering, all that collapse, propaganda kept functioning. Until the very last day, Goebbels and his ministry produced newspapers, radio broadcasts, and pamphlets that spoke of miracle weapons, of the front's firmness, of the final victory. The last issue of the Nazi Party's official newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, was published on April 30th, 1945, the same day Hitler committed suicide. Its headline spoke of the heroic defense of Berlin. The fiction was maintained literally until the last printable moment. Is it possible to exaggerate the magnitude of the destruction Germany suffered in those final months? Probably not. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Only in the final 4 months of the war in Europe, between January and May 1945, more German soldiers and civilians died than in any similar period before. Estimates suggest that between 1.5 and 2 million Germans died in those 4 final months alone. It is as if the war, knowing its time was short, had concentrated all its destructive fury into the final weeks. And when it finally ended, on May 7th and 8th, 1945, when the documents of unconditional surrender were signed, what remained was a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Aerial photographs of German cities in May 1945 show expanses of ruins stretching to the horizon. No buildings standing, no recognisable streets, only mountains of rubble under which lie buried the bodies of those who could not escape. The famous Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, would spend the following years removing by hand the millions of tons of debris that had been the German cities. The contrast between those images of total destruction and the image of the bunker sealed underground is eloquent. Above, the visible result of the war, the physical destruction of a civilization. Below, the invisible result, the moral destruction of a regime, the cyanide marks on the teeth of the dead, the blood on the sofa, the wet red carpet, the empty frames of the stolen paintings. 2 kinds of ruin, one visible to all, the other sealed under meters of concrete, inaccessible but no less real for that. The Third Reich ended as it could only end, in self-destruction. A regime built on violence could only die with violence. A leader who had sent millions to their death could only end by sending himself to his death. A system that had denied the humanity of others ended by denying its own humanity in its final acts, poisoning dogs and children, burning bodies in bombed gardens, drowning in alcohol and despair. There is no grandeur in that ending. There is no dignity. There is no twilight of the gods that the Wagnerian propaganda tried to evoke. There is only a group of frightened people in a damp hole, dying in pathetic ways for a cause that was never worth a single one of the lives it destroyed. In the winter of 1945, a 63-year-old woman walked for 17 consecutive days along snow-covered roads in East Prussia, pushing a baby carriage that contained not a baby, but the few possessions she had managed to save from her house before the Soviets reached her. Around her, thousands of people were doing the same. The thermometer read 20 degrees below zero. The bodies of those who had not withstood the cold accumulated at the sides of the road, frozen in the postures in which they had fallen, some seated, some kneeling, some embracing children who had not survived either. Every morning, when the column of refugees set out again, it was necessary to walk around the new bodies that had appeared during the night. That woman survived. She reached Hamburg 2 months later, weighing 38 kilos, with her feet destroyed by frostbite, and discovered that the city she had reached no longer existed. It was a field of ruins. She had nowhere to go. She had no one. Her husband had died at Stalingrad 2 years before. Her son was missing on the Western Front. Her house was now in territory that would soon be Polish. Everything that had been her life for 6 decades had ceased to exist in the space of a few weeks. And she was not an exceptional case. It was the norm. Millions of people lived that exact same story, with minimal variations, between January and May 1945. How does one survive something like that? How does one rebuild a life when absolutely everything has been destroyed? And how does one process the guilt, the shame, and the horror when you discover that the regime you supported, or at least did not oppose, committed crimes that defy human comprehension? Those questions are what defined post-war Germany, and they are questions that even today, more than 8 decades later, have no completely satisfactory answers. But to understand them, we must go back. We must understand what daily life was like inside Nazi Germany, not just in the final apocalyptic months, but throughout the 12 years of the regime. Because the Third Reich was not only war and genocide, it was also, during at least the first years, a daily life experience for 70 million people. An experience that included going to work, taking children to school, going shopping, celebrating birthdays, falling in love, growing old. All of that happened within the framework of a totalitarian dictatorship, but it happened. And understanding how ordinary people lived within that framework is essential to comprehending how a regime like that was possible for 12 years and enjoyed the popular support that, uncomfortable as it is to admit, was genuine for much of that time. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was devastated, not physically. That devastation would come later, but economically and psychologically. The Great Depression had struck the country with particular fury. 6 million unemployed, an inflation that years before had turned money into worthless paper, a national humiliation following defeat in the First World War that continued to fester like an unhealed wound. The Treaty of Versailles, with its impossible war reparations, its territorial cessions, and its war guilt clause, had created a deep resentment that permeated all of German society, from workers to intellectuals. In that context, the Nazis offered something the Weimar Republic, with its fragile democracy and unstable governments, had failed to provide: certainty, order, direction, a simple narrative that explained who was to blame for all evils: the Jews, the Marxists, the November traitors, and what needed to be done to fix them: national unity, racial purity, territorial expansion, strong leadership. It was a false, toxic, and murderous narrative, but it was simple, and in times of crisis, simplicity has enormous appeal. The first years of the Nazi regime, from 1933 to approximately 1939, were perceived by a majority of Germans as years of improvement. And it is important to understand why, not to justify anything, but to understand the mechanism of totalitarian seduction. Unemployment fell dramatically. The economy recovered, massively boosted by rearmament and public works. The autobahns, the stadiums, the monumental buildings, the regime's social programs, the Kraft durch Freude organization, Strength Through Joy, offered vacations, cruises, cultural events, and even the promise of a popular automobile, the Volkswagen, the people's car, to workers who had never been able to dream of such luxuries. For the average German who was not Jewish, not a gypsy, not a communist, not homosexual, not disabled, for the German who fell into the category of acceptable Aryan, the first years of the regime were, materially, an improvement over the crisis years of Weimar. And that material improvement was the price of their silence. The unwritten pact was clear. We give you work, security, and national pride. And in return, you do not ask what is happening to your Jewish neighbour. Do not question why your communist colleague disappeared one night. Do not complain when you are told your son must join the Hitler Youth. Consent was purchased with employment and maintained with fear. But that consent was not only passive. For many, it was active, even enthusiastic. The Nuremberg rallies, with their columns of hundreds of thousands of people marching with torches, with their searchlights pointing to the sky, creating a cathedral of light, with Hitler's speeches amplified by sound systems that made his voice seem to come from everywhere, were experiences that participants described in almost religious terms. The sense of belonging to something greater than oneself, the feeling of being part of a historical movement, the excitement of the mass acting as a single body. These are powerful psychological forces that do not disappear simply because the ideological content is repugnant. What was a normal day like in Nazi Germany for a typical family? It depended enormously on who you were, where you lived, and at what point in the regime we are situated. But let us take as an example a middle-class family in a city like Stuttgart or Hanover in 1937, before the war. The father works in a factory that has been converted for armaments production, although perhaps he does not know it or prefers not to think about it. He leaves home in the morning, passes in front of the Jewish shops that now have stars of David painted on their windows, and that have fewer and fewer customers, because shopping at Jewish stores is frowned upon, even though it is not yet officially prohibited. He arrives at work, where before beginning the day's shift, everyone performs the Nazi salute, and perhaps listens to a brief speech from the party representative at the factory. He works his hours, returns home. The mother, if she follows the model the regime promotes, is at home caring for the children. The Nazi regime was fiercely traditionalist. In its view of women, their role was to be mothers. Propaganda exalted motherhood as the supreme service of the woman to the nation. Women who had many children received the Cross of Honour of the German mother. Bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, gold for 8. Women were actively discouraged from working outside the home, from studying university degrees, from participating in public life. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. That was the unofficial slogan of the female role in the Third Reich. The children, if boys, are in the Hitler Youth. If girls, in the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel. Membership in these organisations became mandatory in 1939, but even before then the social pressure to join was enormous. Activities included sports, camps, marches, and a constant dose of ideological indoctrination. Boys learned to march, to shoot, to obey without questioning. Girls learned home economics, childcare, and the virtues of motherhood. Both learned that Jews were the enemy, that Germany was superior, that the Führer was infallible. At school, textbooks had been rewritten to reflect Nazi ideology. Mathematics included problems such as, if a German plane flies at 350 kilometers per hour and a British plane flies at 280 kilometers per hour, how long will the German plane take to catch the British one? Biology taught racial theory, with diagrams classifying human races in a hierarchy with Aryans at the top. History had been rewritten to glorify the Germanic past and demonize the enemies of the German people. Teachers who did not adapt to the new curriculum were fired. Those who actively resisted disappeared. And the radio. Radio was perhaps the regime's most powerful tool of control. Goebbels understood this from the start. The production of cheap radio receivers was promoted. The Volksempfänger, people's receivers, which cost only 35 Reichsmarks and were designed to receive only German stations, not foreign ones. By 1939, more than 70% of German households had a radio receiver. The regime's voice could enter every home, every kitchen, every bedroom. Hitler's speeches were broadcast live and factories stopped production so workers could listen to them. It was the pre-television era equivalent of having a government screen in every room. Listening to foreign radio stations was a crime punishable by prison and even death. Thousands of people were convicted of that crime during the war, and yet many did so in secret, with the volume low, in the dark, searching for real information about the course of the war that official propaganda did not provide, because people were not stupid. They knew they were being lied to. But knowing you are being lied to and having access to the truth are two very different things. And what happened if you were Jewish in that Germany? Because everything we have described up to now, the economic improvement, the social programs, the sense of belonging, was exclusively for those who fell into the Aryan category. For German Jews, the experience was exactly the opposite. A gradual, methodical, relentless progression from discrimination to persecution, from persecution to expulsion, from expulsion to murder. In 1933, there were approximately 500,000 Jews in Germany, less than 1% of the population. They were doctors, lawyers, professors, merchants, artists, workers. They were Germans, many of whose families had been living in the country for centuries. Many had fought for Germany in the First World War. Many considered themselves more German than Jewish. And suddenly, from one day to the next, they were no longer citizens. The persecution was gradual. It did not start with gas chambers. It started with laws. The law for the restoration of professional civil service of April 1933 expelled Jews from government posts. Then came the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. Then came Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, when synagogues were burned, Jewish stores destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. And then came the war, and with the war the deportations, and with the deportations the extermination camps. But between each of those steps, there was a daily life that is difficult to describe without a shudder. It was the neighbour who stopped greeting you. It was the store where you used to shop that no longer let you in. It was the park where you used to sit that now had a sign reading, "Forbidden to Jews." It was your child coming home from school crying because his classmates had hit him and the teacher had not intervened. It was the letter from the government saying your business had been Aryanized, that it was no longer yours. It was the policeman demanding that you change your name, that you add Israel or Sarah to your name so that everyone would know what you were. It was the red stamp with the J in your passport. It was the yellow star you had to sew onto your clothes. And it was the impossible decision, stay or go. Those who could and chose to leave in time, who had the resources, the contacts, the visas, who found countries willing to receive them, survived. But leaving was not easy. The Nazis demanded a Reich flight tax that confiscated most of the emigrants' possessions. Receiving countries had strict immigration quotas. Many Jews who tried to emigrate were turned away by country after country. The case of the ship St. Louis in 1939, with more than 900 Jewish refugees who were turned away by Cuba, the United States, and Canada and had to return to Europe, where many of them would end up dying in the Holocaust, is one of the most shameful episodes in Allied history. Those who stayed, whether by choice, inability to emigrate, or the belief that things could not get any worse, lived a nightmare that intensified year after year until it culminated in the mass deportations to the extermination camps. From 1941 onward, The Jews remaining in Germany and their occupied territories were deported eastward to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, Chelmno. The trains departed from ordinary stations in ordinary cities, with almost timetable regularity. Neighbours watched their former Jewish neighbours being taken to the station, loaded into cattle cars, disappearing forever. And life continued. Stores opened, trams ran, children went to school. Normality was maintained around the abyss. How is it possible for an entire society to look away while something like that is happening? It is the question that has haunted philosophers, psychologists, and historians since 1945. The answers are multiple, and none is completely satisfactory. Fear played a role. Propaganda played another. The gradual dehumanization of victims made it psychologically easier to ignore their suffering. And the simple mechanics of daily life, the need to keep going, to maintain normality, to protect your own family, created an inertia that made active resistance extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily rare. But resistance existed. Little, insufficient, often belated, but it existed. And its stories are some of the most moving and most tragic of the Nazi period. The White Rose. A group of students from the University of Munich, led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, who between June 1942 and February 1943 distributed pamphlets calling for resistance against the Nazi regime. They were young, idealistic, brave to the point of recklessness. Their pamphlets, written with an eloquence and a moral clarity that contrasted violently with official propaganda, called on Germans to wake up, to recognise the crimes being committed in their name, to resist. They were discovered, arrested, tried by the People's Court under Roland Freisler, a Nazi judge known for his show trials, where he screamed at and humiliated the accused, and executed. Hans Scholl was 24 years old when he was beheaded. Sophie was 21. Sophie Scholl's last words before being executed, according to testimonies, were, "What a beautiful day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people wake up and act?" She was 21 years old, and she died because she believed that words could change something, that truth mattered, that silence was complicity. In a country of 70 million people who were mostly silent, a handful of students spoke, and they paid with their lives. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran theologian who joined the conspiracy against Hitler and was executed at the Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9th, 1945, barely a month before the end of the war. Klaus von Stauffenberg, the colonel who placed the bomb that nearly killed Hitler on July 20th, 1944, and who was shot that same night when the coup failed. Georg Elzer, the carpenter who acted completely alone when he attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at the Bürgerbraukeller in Munich in November 1939, missing by 13 minutes because Hitler unexpectedly cut short his speech. Elzer was captured, imprisoned for years, and executed at Dachau on April 9th, 1945, the same day as Bonhoeffer. These resistors were exceptions. Most Germans did not resist. Most adapted, consented, participated, or at least kept silent. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of this entire story, that evil on a grand scale does not require that the majority of people be evil. It only requires that the majority be indifferent, or frightened, or comfortable, or simply too busy living their lives to confront the implications of what is happening around them. But how did the daily experience change when the war began? On September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and unleashed World War II, the lives of ordinary Germans changed in ways many had not anticipated. Rationing was imposed immediately. Food, clothing, soap, fuel. Everything was rationed. Ration cards became more valuable than money. The quality of life the regime had provided in the peacetime years began to erode. However, during the first years of the war, morale remained high. The lightning victories in Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, and especially France, the humiliation of France in June 1940, created a euphoria that compensated for the inconveniences of rationing. Germany seemed invincible. Hitler's predictions were coming true one after another. Skeptics were silenced by events, and the regime made sure that the material benefits of looting conquered countries reached the German population. Soldiers sent packages home with products no longer available in Germany: French chocolate, Dutch tobacco, Belgian silk stockings. The empire was at the service of the German citizens' welfare, at least the citizen who was not Jewish, gypsy, or politically suspect. But Stalingrad changed everything. The defeat of the Sixth Army in February 1943, the first great German defeat that was impossible to conceal, was a turning point in the population's morale. 200,000 German soldiers had been sent to Stalingrad. Only about 6,000 would eventually return from Soviet captivity many years later. Almost all the rest died, whether in combat, from hunger, from cold, or in captivity. Almost every family in Germany knew someone who had been at Stalingrad. Death notifications were arriving at thousands of homes, and propaganda, which had until then promised victories, had to change its tone. Goebbels delivered his famous Total War speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18, 1943, asking the audience if they wanted total war and receiving a roaring yes. But that yes was wrested by mass hysteria, not by the genuine conviction of a population that was beginning to feel afraid. From Stalingrad onward, fear became the dominant emotion of German daily life. Fear of bombings, which intensified month by month. Fear of news from the front, which was increasingly bad. Fear of the Gestapo, which became more active as dissent grew. Fear of the future, which darkened day by day. The jokes, which in Germany had always been a form of passive resistance, became more bitter. What is the difference between Germany and the sun? The sun rises in the east. Enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible. Telling these jokes could cost you your life if the wrong person heard you, but people told them anyway, in whispers, in the darkness of basements during bombings, as a way of maintaining some contact with the reality that propaganda denied. The sexual life under Nazism is an aspect that is rarely discussed, but reveals much about the nature of the regime. The Nazis had a deeply contradictory attitude towards sexuality. On one hand, they actively promoted it, at least within racial parameters. Programs such as Lebensborn, literally fount of life, encouraged Aryan women to have children with SS men, even outside of marriage, to produce more racially pure children. Unmarried mothers from these programs received state support and did not suffer the social stigma that would normally accompany them. Reproduction was a national duty, and the methods for fulfilling it were secondary. On the other hand, sexuality that did not serve the regime's purposes was brutally repressed. Male homosexuality was a crime punishable by concentration camps. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexual men were sent to concentration camps during the Third Reich, where they wore inverted pink triangles and were treated with particular cruelty even within the concentration camp system. Sexual relations between Aryans and Jews, or people of other inferior races, were a serious crime under the Nuremberg laws. The so-called Rassenschande, or racial shame, punishable by imprisonment. Pornography was prohibited, but circulated clandestinely. Prostitution existed in a legal grey zone, officially disapproved of but tolerated in practice, and even organised by the regime itself in concentration camps, where women prisoners were forced to serve as prostitutes for prisoners of higher categories as a productivity incentive. The brutality of this system, in which enslaved women were systematically raped as part of a labour productivity scheme, is one of the darkest and least discussed aspects of the concentration camp system. And culture. What did Germans read, watch, and listen to during the Third Reich? Cultural life was completely controlled by the Reichskulturkammer, the Reich Chamber of Culture, directed by Goebbels, to work in any cultural field, whether cinema, theatre, music, literature, fine arts, or the press. One had to be a member of the corresponding chamber, and membership could be denied on racial or political grounds. Jews were excluded. Avant-garde artists were excluded. Those who did not adapt to official taste were excluded. The result was a massive cultural impoverishment. Germany's finest artists, writers, musicians, and scientists emigrated. Einstein, Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Marlene Dietrich, Fritz Lang, Kurt Weill, Hannah Arendt, and thousands more left the country. Those who remained produced what the regime approved: propagandistic cinema, Wagnerian operas, naturalistic painting that glorified the German landscape and the Aryan body, literature that extolled the regime's values. Not everything was crude propaganda. There were technically competent films, genuinely beautiful music, and literary works of some quality, but creative freedom had disappeared, and with it the vitality that had made Weimar-era German culture one of the most innovative in the world. Cinema was the regime's most powerful cultural tool. Leni Riefenstahl, the director who created Triumph of the Will and Olympia, demonstrated that propaganda could be art and art could be propaganda. Her films were technically brilliant, visually dazzling, and morally repugnant. But beyond explicit propaganda, most films produced during the Third Reich were entertainment, comedies, melodramas, musical films. Goebbels understood that you could not bombard the public with propaganda all the time. You also needed to entertain them, distract them, give them an escape from reality. Movie theatres in Nazi Germany were full. People needed to forget, and cinema was the best vehicle for forgetting. There is one piece of information that is revealing. The last film officially released in the Third Reich was Kohlberg, a historical epic drama about the resistance of a Prussian city against Napoleon in 1807. It was released on January 30th, 1945, the 12th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, in a Germany being invaded from the east and bombed from the west. The film had cost more than 8 million Reichsmarks, an astronomical sum, and its production had required thousands of soldiers as extras at a time when every soldier was desperately needed at the front. Goebbels had commissioned it as an inspiring example of resistance against a superior enemy. The irony was obvious to everyone except, apparently, Goebbels himself. Kohlberg in 1807 had resisted and survived. Germany in 1945 was not going to. The film was screened in very few theatres, because most of the country's cinemas had been destroyed by bombing. Its audience was minimal. It was the swan song of the Nazi film industry, and its commercial failure was as resounding as it was appropriate. What was happening with religion in Nazi Germany? How did a regime that in many ways was itself a substitute religion relate to the established churches? The answer is complex and reveals yet another of the Third Reich's many contradictions. Officially, the regime maintained a stance of respect toward Christianity. Hitler, in his public speeches, frequently invoked God and Providence. The SS motto, Gott mit uns, God with us, was engraved on the belt buckles of soldiers. The Nazi Party signed a concordat with the Vatican in 1933 that supposedly guaranteed the freedom of the Catholic Church in Germany. But in practice, the regime was deeply hostile to organised religion, which it saw as a competitor for the population's loyalty. The Kirchenkampf, the struggle against the churches, was a sustained campaign of pressure, infiltration, and repression that sought to weaken the power of the churches without provoking an open confrontation that would alienate the believing population. Priests and pastors who opposed the regime were persecuted. Pastor Martin Niemöller, who founded the Confessing Church as an alternative to the Nazified Protestant Church, spent 7 years in concentration camps. Thousands of Catholic priests were sent to Dachau. At the same time, the regime promoted a pagan mysticism, manifested in rituals, symbolism, and ceremonies that imitated religious forms, but filled them with Nazi content. Solstices were celebrated as national holidays. Party ceremonies, with their flags, hymns, torch processions, and loyalty oaths, had a deliberately liturgical structure. Hitler was presented as a messianic figure and his word carried the weight of divine revelation. For many Germans, especially the young who had grown up within the system, Nazism was their religion, and the Führer's faith, as it was explicitly called in some texts, was their creed. This quasi-religious dimension of Nazism is crucial to understanding the suicides in the bunker. When the god dies, his most devoted followers die with him. It is no coincidence that those who committed suicide in the final days were the most ideologically committed: Goebbels, Bormann, high-ranking SS officers. Those who had a life beyond the regime, those who maintained connections with reality, not mediated by ideology, were the ones who tried to survive. The difference between committing suicide and attempting to escape was, in many cases, the difference between believing in Nazism as an absolute truth and seeing it for what it was: a lethal political system that was coming to an end. But let us return to daily life, because there are aspects we have not yet covered that are fundamental to understanding the total experience of living in Nazi Germany. Denunciation. The Nazi system could not control 70 million people with the Gestapo and the SS alone. The number of Gestapo agents was surprisingly small. It is estimated that throughout all of Germany there were only about 32,000 Gestapo agents, for a population of 66 million. That is one agent per 2,000 people, insufficient for effective control without the active participation of the population, and that participation was obtained through denunciation. Historians Robert Gellertly and Eric Johnson, among others, have demonstrated that most Gestapo investigations did not originate through police work itself, but through reports from ordinary citizens. Neighbours denouncing neighbours, colleagues denouncing colleagues, family members denouncing family members. The motivations range from genuine ideological fanaticism to the pettiest of reasons: personal vendettas, commercial disputes, romantic rivalries. If you wanted to get rid of an inconvenient rival, a noisy neighbour, a dishonest partner, a denunciation to the Gestapo was a devastatingly effective weapon. The result was an atmosphere of universal distrust. You never knew who might denounce you. A careless comment in the bakery queue, an expression of skepticism about the war in the presence of the wrong person, a joke about Hitler overheard by a vengeful neighbour. Any of these things could result in a Gestapo visit at 4 a.m. Self-censorship became a second nature. You learned to control not only what you said, but your facial expression, your body language, your involuntary reactions. Living under a dictatorship is not just being unable to speak freely. It is having to act constantly, to play a role of conformity 24 hours a day, because at any moment, someone might be watching. Children were particularly dangerous in this regard. Children indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth learned that their first loyalty was to the Führer and the state, above family. There are documented cases of sons who denounced their own parents for defeatist remarks, or for listening to foreign radio stations. The regime's paranoia corrupted even the most intimate family relationships, inserting distrust into the very heart of the home. And yet, people managed to maintain certain spaces of privacy, humanity, minor resistance. The jokes, as already mentioned, the eloquent silences, the minimal gestures of solidarity, leaving a food package at a Jewish neighbour's door during the night when no one could see, looking the other way when you were supposed to report. These forms of everyday resistance, what historian Martin Brozat called resistance, were not heroic and did not change the course of history, but they kept alive a minimal flame of decency amid the darkness. And there was one aspect of daily life that the regime tried to control but never completely dominated: humour. Germans under Nazism developed a sophisticated dark humour that functioned as a safety valve and as a way of speaking truths that could not be said any other way. What is the difference between India and Germany? In India, one starves for everyone. In Germany, everyone starves for one. Two men meet. "Beautiful day," says one. "Yes," replies the other. "But don't say that out loud or they'll send it to the Eastern Front." What is an Aryan? Someone as blonde as Hitler, as tall as Goebbels, and as slim as Goering. These jokes circulated in whispers and survived in collective memory as proof that not the entire population was completely hypnotized. The daily life experience also varied enormously between rural and urban areas. In the countryside, life changed less dramatically with the arrival of Nazism. Farmers continued to cultivate their lands. The seasons continued to dictate the rhythm of life. Small communities maintained their traditional social structures. The regime tried to romanticize the countryside through the ideology of blood and soil, which exalted the German peasant as the essence of the race. But in practice, farmers were more concerned with the prices of their products and with the scarcity of labour, since their sons were being called up for military service, than with ideological considerations. Nevertheless, even in the countryside, the war had a devastating impact. Prisoners of war and forced labourers, brought from the occupied territories, became a common presence on German farms, where they replaced the men who were at the front. By 1944, there were more than 7 million forced labourers in Germany, an astonishing number that meant that in many workplaces, farms included, the majority of workers were enslaved foreigners. These workers lived in conditions ranging from tolerable to inhumane, depending on the whim of their employers and their nationality. Western European workers were treated somewhat better than those from the East. Poles, and especially Soviets, classified as subhumans by Nazi ideology, lived in conditions that often did not differ much from concentration camps. The presence of these forced labourers in German daily life is yet another uncomfortable fact that disproves the post-war claim of "we knew nothing." Millions of Germans coexisted daily with enslaved people, saw them working in their factories and farms, knew where they came from and what conditions they lived in. It did not require knowing the existence of Auschwitz to know that the regime was treating certain human beings as objects. The evidence was in every town, every factory, every farm. And how did that coexistence end when the war was lost? What happened to those millions of forced labourers when Germany was occupied? Many were liberated by the Allies and classified as displaced persons, an administrative euphemism for millions of human beings who had been uprooted from their homes and who now had nowhere to return. Some did not want to return, especially the Soviets, who knew that Stalin considered prisoners of war as traitors, and that many would be sent to the Gulag upon returning. Some could not return because their homes no longer existed, destroyed by the war or located in territories whose borders had changed. And some found that once free, the rage accumulated during years of enslavement expressed itself in acts of revenge against the local German population. The lootings, the violence, and the score settling of the first days of liberation were a chaotic and painful chapter that few historical narratives address in depth. All of this formed part of the fabric of daily life in Nazi Germany. It was not a single monolithic narrative, but millions of individual experiences, each different, each conditioned by who you were, where you were, what year it was, and how much luck you had. But there was a common thread connecting all those experiences: the progressive loss of normality, the slow but unstoppable erosion of everything that makes life recognizable and livable. First you lose freedom of expression, then you lose your Jewish neighbours, then you lose your children at the front, then you lose your quiet nights when the bombings begin, then you lose your house, then you lose your city. And at the end, if you survive, all that remains is the question: how was it possible? How did I allow this to happen? What part of the blame is mine? That question is what defined post-war Germany. The Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally overcoming the past, became a national process that continues today, and it was not a clean or honest process from the beginning. During the first years of the post-war period, in the 1950s and 1960s, Germany largely practiced silence and forgetting. The generation that had lived through the war did not want to talk about it. Parents did not tell their children. Grandparents were silent. Society rebuilt its cities, its economy, its material life, and buried the past under layers of prosperity and restored normality. It was the next generation, the children of those who had lived through the war, that began asking uncomfortable questions. The student movement of 1968 in Germany had a dimension that existed in no other country: direct confrontation with the parents' generation. What did you do during the war, Dad? Did you know what was happening? Why didn't you do anything? Those questions, formulated with the anger and intransigence of youth, open wounds that have taken decades to heal and will probably never heal completely. And perhaps they should not heal. Perhaps there are wounds a country needs to keep open as a reminder. Germany's decision not to mark the site of Hitler's bunker, not to make it a monument, is part of that philosophy. It is not about forgetting. It is about remembering without glorifying, about maintaining memory without creating a pilgrimage site, about teaching history without romanticizing it. It is a difficult balance, and Germany has not always achieved it perfectly, but the effort itself is significant. Few countries have confronted their criminal past with the honesty and persistence Germany has shown since the 1960s. Now, there is an aspect of life inside Nazi Germany that is almost never discussed, and which nevertheless affected millions of people in profound and lasting ways. It concerns mental health. What happens to the human psyche when you live for years under a combination of state terror, constant bombing, loss of loved ones, and collective guilt? What are the psychological consequences of living in a state of chronic stress, permanent fear, unprocessed grief? The answer is devastating consequences that lasted generations. The concept of transgenerational trauma, the idea that the unprocessed trauma of parents is transmitted to children through behavioural patterns, silences, anxieties, and dysfunctional attachments, has been extensively studied in the context of post-war Germany. The children of soldiers who returned from the Eastern Front with what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder grew up with emotionally absent, violent, alcoholic parents, or simply parents incapable of expressing affection. Mothers who had been raped, bombed, or displaced transmitted their anxiety and hypervigilance to their children. And the children grew up without understanding why their families were the way they were, because nobody spoke, nobody explained, nobody processed. German psychologist Sabine Bode has extensively documented what she calls the war children, the generation born between 1930 and 1945 who grew up amid destruction. These children experienced bombings, evacuations, loss of parents, hunger, cold, and the complete destruction of their known world at a stage of development when stability and security are fundamental. Many of them developed an extraordinary capacity for resilience and adaptation, but also an equally extraordinary inability to connect emotionally, to feel security, to trust. They built post-war Germany with admirable energy and determination, but emotionally many of them remained frozen in the basements of their childhood, forever awaiting the next bomb. And the perpetrators? What happened to the mental health of those who directly participated in the crimes? There are studies showing that members of the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads that murdered more than 1.5 million Jews through mass shootings on the Eastern Front, suffered extremely high rates of alcoholism, psychosomatic illness, and mental breakdowns. Himmler himself, after witnessing a mass shooting and feeling physically sick, ordered the search for killing methods that would be less traumatic for the killers. Not for the victims, of course, for the killers. The gas chambers were in part a solution to that problem, a method that psychologically distanced the killer from his act, creating a bureaucratic chain where no individual felt total responsibility. The train driver did not kill, he just drove the train. The camp guard did not kill, he just maintained order. The technician who opened the gas valve did not kill, he was just following orders. Each link in the chain could deny individual responsibility, and the result was that millions died without anyone feeling personally responsible. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil when she covered Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann, The bureaucrat who had organized the logistics of transporting millions of Jews to the extermination camps was not a horned monster. He was a mediocre, grey man who spoke of train schedules and transport capacities with the same indifference with which a company manager talks about supply chains. He did not particularly hate Jews. He was simply doing his job, following orders, being efficient. And that efficiency killed millions. The lesson of Eichmann, the lesson of the banality of evil, is perhaps the most terrifying of all the lessons of the Third Reich, because it suggests that it does not require being a monster to participate in monstrousness. It only requires being obedient, efficient, and capable of not thinking too much about the consequences of your actions. And that is a capacity all human beings possess. The barrier between decency and complicity is far thinner than we would like to believe. But let us return to the final days, because there is one episode that connects everything we have discussed. Daily life, the collapse of the regime, the experience of civilians, and the agony of the bunker, in a particularly powerful way. It is what happened in Berlin in the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, the hours immediately following Hitler's death and the escape of the bunker survivors. That night, Berlin was total chaos. Street fighting continued in some sectors, while in others, German soldiers were already surrendering. Civilians who had spent weeks in basements and shelters did not know whether to go out or stay hidden. German radio had stopped broadcasting, or was broadcasting only Wagner music interspersed with incoherent communiques. Rumours spread faster than any verifiable information. Hitler is dead. No, Hitler has escaped. The Soviets are going to kill us all. No, the Americans are coming. Each rumour created a panic or an ephemeral hope that lasted until the next rumour replaced it. In field hospitals, the wounded kept arriving even when there were no longer any doctors or medicines to care for them. Surgeons operated with kitchen knives sterilised with vodka when no instruments remained. Nurses, many of them teenagers like Johanna Ruff, did what they could with the resources they had, which were practically nothing. The cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of combat and the sobs of civilians who could do nothing but wait. And somewhere below all that, beneath the rubble and bodies and smoke, the Führer bunker lay practically empty. Only Henschel with his machines, keeping the electricity running, and a little further on, in another section of the complex, the bodies of Goebbels' 6 children, still dressed in the white clothes their mother had put on them, still in the beds where they had been laid to sleep for the last time. When Soviet soldiers entered the bunker on the morning of May 2nd, they encountered the bodies of the children before finding anything else. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Klimenko of the Smersh was one of the first to see them. According to his testimony, the image of those 6 children dead in their beds was what disturbed him most of everything he saw in the bunker. And we are talking about a man hardened by years of war on the Eastern Front. The children were the final, irrefutable proof that what had inhabited that bunker was not just an enemy government or army. It was something darker, something that escaped the normal categories of war. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin formally surrendered. General Weidlin, the one who had nearly been executed by Hitler and ended up surrendering for him, signed the capitulation and issued an order to the remaining troops to cease fighting. Not all obeyed immediately. Some SS groups continued fighting for hours, or even days after the surrender, whether from fanaticism or simply because they had not received the order. But for most of Berlin's defenders, the war was over. They emerged from their positions with their hands raised, some relieved, some terrified, some simply empty. Civilians emerged from their basements, blinking in the sunlight that many had not seen for days or weeks. What they found above was unrecognizable. Their city was a lunar landscape. The streets they knew by heart were now canyons of rubble. The buildings where they had lived were mountains of broken bricks. The smell was a mixture of smoke, rot, and something sweet that nobody wanted to identify. The smell of uncollected bodies decomposing beneath the rubble. The contrast between those images of total destruction and the image of the sealed bunker underground is eloquent. Above, the visible result of the war, the physical destruction of a civilization. Below, the invisible result, the moral destruction of a regime, the cyanide marks on the teeth of the dead, the blood on the sofa, the wet red carpet, the empty frames of the stolen paintings. Two kinds of ruin, one visible to all, the other sealed under meters of concrete, inaccessible, but no less real for that. The Third Reich ended as it could only end, in self-destruction. A regime built on violence could only die with violence. A leader who had sent millions to their deaths could only end by sending himself to his death. A system that had denied the humanity of others ended by denying its own humanity in its final acts, poisoning dogs and children, burning bodies in bombed gardens, drowning in alcohol and despair. There is no grandeur in that ending. There is no dignity. There is no twilight of the gods that Wagnerian propaganda tried to evoke. There is only a group of frightened people in a damp hole, dying in pathetic ways for a cause that was never worth a single one of the lives it destroyed.